trauma and how what happens in our bodies when we go through traumatic experiences. Our bodies have this amazing capacity for memory, and they hold traumatic experiences. And your brain stores traumatic experiences, and your cells carry a memory. And it's an amazing thing that is part of our design for us to remember things so that we can protect ourselves. And our bodies have this amazing capacity to remind us of things that hurt, things that were damaging. And so we talked about how that happens, and how living in a broken world creates wounds in each of us. And we go through life, and we're used to a normal, what we think is normal. It's just the world we live in, and this is how it is. And the reality is, what the scripture points to is that we were made for something much, much greater and better than the world we currently experience. And we, as we go through life, we get hints of that. We get little snapshots of this is what life should be like, and yet reality is often disappointing. And so this is all pointing us, as Tim said just a little bit ago as we're praying, how this points us to our need for God, our need for restoration, our need for something to be done about this. And so as we talk about healing, we're diving into a hard subject, because this is one of those subjects where we have lots of disappointments, where things don't heal, where things don't get better, where people don't recover. And we're diving into some hard territory. But my hope is that as we go through this series, we're going to get to some places where we have some practical tools on how to self-heal, because God has given us tools to do a lot of our own healing work. And the instructions are in the scriptures, and it has to do with our minds, it has to do with our bodies, it has to do with our perspective, and we can heal in an amazing capacity. We don't always heal, we don't always recover from things, and yet there is this message in the gospel that says things can be different, things can be made new, and we want to lean into that as much as is available to us. So Jeremiah chapter 8 talks about how the people of Israel at the time were being they were not being cared for in a very good way, and the religious leaders are being chastised by the prophet, saying, you don't consider their wound and take it seriously. You've looked at the wound of my people and said it's not serious. And that's kind of what we're doing. We live in a normal world, a sense of normal, where we just kind of get along the best we can. And I think what the gospel invites us into is to go into the death so that we can experience resurrection. It's always about going into that place of fear, that place of pain, that place of brokenness, and bringing it into the light so that God can restore. And that's hard work. It's internal work, it's external work, it's in all kinds of ways. We're specifically focusing on the internal aspect of this in this series primarily. And so today we're going to talk about trauma and triggers. Now, how many of you have heard of a trigger? Okay, a few of you. Trigger. It's kind of a buzzword, but it's basically referring to something that sets you off. When you get triggered, you get set off. Suddenly, stuff's not okay. It opens a deep wound. It takes you into this survival mode mentality. The lizard brain takes over, and suddenly you're a different person. And I think we've all probably experienced this on some level. There's some good examples of this, but your body responds when you're triggered. Your body responds to trauma, usually, that's caused by some sort of environmental or social or emotional stimuli. So 3 basic kind of categories to think about as you think about triggers. Your environment can trigger something, and a good example of this would be road rage. So not a lot of that around here, because the streets are pretty, they're pretty calm most of the time. But if you go drive in the city, you'll experience a lot of road rage, right? I can think of a lot of examples of this. Oh my goodness. I'm going to share a story in a little bit about this. So that's an example of external environment, a trigger where people just kind of fly off the handle. You can think of as a social trigger, maybe a marital dispute. Your social connections. Usually it's the people that are closest to us that trigger us the most because they know us, and with time and relationship, every marriage experiences these hot spots where you trigger each other, and suddenly you're in a fight, and we're going to talk more about that in a little bit too. And then if you think of like an emotional trigger, I gave the example last week of a war veteran, somebody who goes and experiences traumatic things in a battle zone and then comes home and suddenly their emotions they're just everywhere. And they, without warning, something will trigger a memory and emotions will rise up, and it's debilitating. In fact, the suicide rate in soldiers who come back from those situations is really high. And it's a real situation. So I like to use this picture of Samuel L. Jackson is the poster child for getting triggered. I just love these photos. If you've ever watched any movies with him in it, he has these great looks, this angry look where, oh, you just did it, And there's a couple examples of that. But this is the kind of the thing we're talking about. When you get triggered, it can be anger, it can be fear, it can be a lot of things. But when I get triggered, I feel a sudden rush of emotion, perhaps fear or anger. My heart starts to beat faster, and I can feel it. Sometimes you can feel your chest, you go, when you're in one of those situations. And then I can't catch my breath. I can't. When I start talking, it's like I can't. I'm having to take stops so I can keep talking because there's stuff going on, right? It's internal, and you can't do anything about it, and you feel really helpless, and this anxiety comes up, and tightness, and butterflies in your stomach, or whatever. Lots of different ways it can happen. And I'm thinking you can probably think of some situations where this has happened, or maybe happens regularly for you. Maybe you have a person who knows just how to push your buttons the right way. And when they do that, boy, the cycle starts, right? And then it takes you down this spiral. Maybe if you encounter a certain environmental thing or circumstance, it reminds you of something traumatic. Perhaps some authority figures or family members can be triggering because of past experiences of abuse or something like that. That was a situation where you were supposed to be protected or in a good place, and it turned into something bad. And so there's all kinds of things that can do this. But whatever it is, you may not even be aware that it's happening at the moment. Suddenly you're just kind of in the moment and it's happening. And then it's afterwards usually where you kind of look back and you're like, man, what happened there? Why did I fly off the handle? Why was I so emotional at that moment? Like, why was I almost crying in that situation? That makes no sense. Or why was I unable to articulate my thoughts clearly? It was just like my brain went out the window. Or why did I feel like a child next to these people that I would consider my peers, and all of a sudden I felt like a little kid in their presence? So it happens in all kinds of ways like this. I'm guessing, is everybody relating to this? You can experience, okay, good. Not the only one. So whatever it is, your body begins to react, and it feels pretty powerless. So here's my story about road rage. So I remember a couple of years, this was a lot of years ago. This was back when Lisa and I lived in Ohio. And she's laughing, she knows what I'm going to talk about. This is in the first couple of years of our marriage. And I don't remember where we're coming back from, but we're driving. Lisa had a Dodge Neon at the time. And it was one of those years for Dodge Neons where the head gaskets were bad. And so we were having issues, and we were coming back from some trip, and it was starting to get really bad. It was every time you would slow down or stop, the car would die. And so what we have to do is slow down and shift it neutral and put the gas on to keep it from dying, and that's kind of how we got home. It wasn't a good situation. Anyway, we're getting pretty close to home, and we go through this toll booth. And of course, I'm in the toll booth. I'm trying to keep it going, but I'm trying to pay the person at the same time, and I couldn't do it, and the car dies. So I'm like, oh. So it takes several times, we're trying to get it started. Suddenly, we feel this bump in our car from behind us. And we're like, whoa. And then all of a sudden, we're being pushed out of the toll booth by a guy in a truck behind us. And we're just, what in the world? And we're looking back, and it's just some guy who's gotten impatient with us. So he decided to just push us out of the way. Our little Dodge Neon, it's not very big. And so he pushes us out of the toll booth. And then this is the clincher. He drives around us. And as he's driving by, we're like in shock. We're like, what in the world? We look over, he's driving by, and he's like, like it's our fault that he, just like he had every right to push us out of the toll booth. Well, so what he didn't realize is that by doing that, he triggered all of my anger issues from the time I was a little boy up until the time I was in my 20s. And I was furious, and the brain went out the window, and I was like, this guy's dead. So I got it started, and I'm chasing, and the guy's driving like 85. And he's in this little, it wasn't a very big truck. It was actually kind of like a little Nissan or something, but it's big enough to push our car. And I'm doing probably, 115 trying to catch him. Somehow with the head gaskets, it held up, I don't know. And I'm coming, and I am so furious, right? I am ramming this guy off the road, and as soon as I ram him off the road, I am beating him up and probably killing him. So I'm not thinking at all. I'm so angry. Yeah, and you feel righteous too, right? So that even just adds, I'm justified in this whole thing. If he dies, it's his fault. So thankfully, I have Lisa in the passenger seat, and she's there, and she's like, okay, just calm down. She's talking me through it, and I'm just like, don't talk to me. And she's like, he probably has all these issues in his life where, he's just angry, and he doesn't really understand what he's doing, and she's doing everything she can to kind of talk me down. And I got to where we finally caught up to the guy. And by that time, it was, maybe 30 seconds. And I caught up to him. And by that time, Lisa had miraculously brought me back down enough that I didn't run him off the road. So it's one of those issues where, and then I look back and I'm like, wow, I probably would have killed that guy. It was just, I was not in my mind. I was in a place of insane anger. So that's one example of a trigger, an angry trigger. Another one I'll tell you about, my wife and I, we've experienced 4 miscarriages during our 16 years of marriage. And each time it's been pretty traumatic. It's been really hard. And specifically the last one was the hardest one, which happened in 2016. And we were much further along in the pregnancy. And so we went through this very, very difficult loss, and it was traumatic, and all the things that come with that. For those, many of you have gone through similar and way worse things. And so you kind of carry that. You carry it in you. And this was right before I began to work as a chaplain in the hospital. And what I found was when I was in the hospital, I would go, I'd visit sick people, I'd visit traumatic, accidents and all kinds of things. But when I went into the infants unit, that was by far the hardest thing for me, because it triggered all of that loss of our baby. And so every time I would go in there, I would begin to feel it. The heartbeat going up, the breath getting shortened. It was very hard. And so every time something like that happened, I felt debilitated. I felt like I couldn't think straight, and there was just some deep healing that needed to happen. And yet I could go into the trauma bay and see severed limbs and horrible traumatic accidents and people with gunshot wounds and beaten and bloodied assault victims. I saw all kinds of stuff in there, and I was fine. It was a little shocking at first, but I got used to it, to seeing blood and guts, and I was okay in those situations. But the babies, I couldn't do that very well because it triggered me in a really, really awful way. So everyone's story is different. And what is intolerable to one person is no big deal to another. And it just depends on your story. It depends on what you've been through. And it's all the more reason for us to embody compassion for each other's pain, and to recognize that, my story is not your story, vice versa, and it's best to seek understanding rather than to say, well, you should just get over that because it's not a big deal. Well, it might not be to you, but it might be to the person you're talking with. So we're going to look at the story in 2 Kings chapter 5 and see how two different people experience two different kinds of triggers because of their unique stories. So if you go to 2 Kings chapter 5, we start in verse 1 and we read about Naaman, who's a great man, it says in verse 1. He's the commander of the army of the king of Aram. He was a great man in the sight of his master and highly regarded because through him the Lord had given victory to Aram. He was a valiant soldier, but he had leprosy. You hear that? So here we are. He's this great man. He's got all this decorated, accomplishment. He's a great man. And yet, he had leprosy. He had protected Syria from the great threat of the neighboring powerhouse Assyria. He was known for his great feats in battle, and he was honored among his people. But he had this thing. He had this leprosy. So when you're a soldier and you're fighting battles, you're out on display and you're wearing armor. And nobody can see what's underneath the armor. You're just covered, you look tough, you're ready to go. But underneath is the vulnerability, under the surface. Underneath his armor, Naaman was carrying a sickness. He was a valiant soldier, but he had leprosy. A lot of times Christians wear armor, and we fear ever being vulnerable because there's a lot of pain down there, and there's a lot of hurt, and there's a lot of things that we're afraid of underneath our armor. And that's the way we've been since the garden. We've learned to cover ourselves with fig leaves, and we've learned to hide the shadows and the parts that we don't want to think about or talk about or remember or anything. And it's not just true for Christians, it's true for everybody. And so sometimes people balk at any type of work where you dig into your past and where you talk about your pain or you talk about your feelings or you start looking at internal work because it's messy. And it's understandable, I get it. However, the reason is not to dwell and stay there and to turn yourself into a victim and any of that stuff. It's just so you can become conscious of it. You can become aware and acknowledge it, as we talked about last week, acknowledging what's there because it's guiding your story. Acknowledging it and then confronting the lies that are often built around those things because our pain constructs a narrative for us. We begin to form lies and beliefs around them as a way of protecting ourselves. And then we do life and we learn to medicate our lives with the narratives we tell ourselves. And it's complicated, right? It's very messy and it's unique to each individual. Everybody's is different. And I believe God wants to bring stuff into the light and heal it. He wants to help us become more whole. He wants to help us renew our minds. But the way trauma works is that it creates this unconscious belief system. And this belief system then guides us. And sometimes we're not aware of the things that are actually guiding our lives from the inside. Jesus talks about out of the heart, all of the things that we do are coming out of this deep internal center. And it's what's in there that is the issue. Our pain often helps us create a God image that is idolatrous. We may not know that it's idolatrous even, but our pain can construct a narrative around our belief systems to where we're interpreting and filtering things in a particular way that is actually idolatrous. And we shape our gods, and then our gods shape us. And it's just this cycle that happens. Have you ever wondered how Israel, how they could possibly and consistently construct false idols after the real God had sent plagues? And after the real God had parted the sea, and after the real God had sent manna in the wilderness and delivered them from Pharaoh's hand and provided water from a rock and appeared in a pillar of fire and all these things, the real God had shown himself clearly. And they still constructed idols. You ever thought about that? Why did they still construct idols? What's going on? If all these displays of miraculous power are to prove that there's a God, we should really be set by now. We've had enough of that. We've had plenty. In our own lives, we've had plenty of reasons to believe in a God. We've had plenty of reasons to trust the gospel. And yet, sometimes we're being undermined by internal stuff. Okay, so back to the story. Israel and Aram were not on great terms. Aram is Naaman's country, and he often would send raids to gain spoils and also to remind the neighboring surrounding territories that he has this power, he has this ability to come conquer, and so you just better watch out. And that's kind of how it worked in the ancient Near East. You threatened with manipulation and showed your force, and it's not a whole lot different than today, really. But that's how it worked. And this is how armies would kind of keep each other in check, and nations would warn other nations. And so Naaman had probably led a lot of raids, being the lead guy. And this left Israel and Aram in sort of a Cold War. And they weren't at war at this particular time, but they were not necessarily on great terms. And Israel had been raided by Aram. And so we read in verse 2 how Naaman's wife had a servant girl from one of the raids who was there to serve her now and lived in Naaman's quarters. So verse 2 it says, "Now bands of raiders from Aram had gone out and had taken captive a young girl from Israel, and she served Naaman's wife." So one day, this girl from Israel sees under the armor of Naaman because of her unique position in his life. You know how this works? If you're close enough to somebody long enough, you begin to see under their armor, right? You begin to see who they are. This girl sees who Naaman is. She sees Naaman's weakness. And so she mentions to his mistress, hey, if Naaman will go see the prophet who, Elisha, he can heal her. He can heal him. And so this is mentioned to Naaman, and Naaman decides to give it a shot. In verse 4, it says, Naaman went to his master and told him what the girl from Israel had said. Now think about this. This is a servant girl. This is not anybody special, not anybody he would probably trust. I mean, after all, he had captured her, brought her out of her land. She probably just wants to get home, Maybe she's trying to figure out a way. I don't know. Maybe she's just really nice. She just wants to help him. But whatever happens, Naaman takes her up on this. Because sometimes you reach a point where you have to heal. Sometimes you reach a point where life cannot continue to move forward until something shifts. And Naaman had reached such a point. And so this young slave girl throws out this possibility, and he has the courage and the curiosity to just go for it. And so he tells the king, and the king writes him a letter, and off he goes. And Naaman is carrying a boatload of cash to pay for his healing, because he believes, that's probably what it's going to take. And yet, this is a kind of a crazy act of faith that Naaman is doing here. Now notice in verse 6 how the language of what happens here. This letter is sent. He gets to Israel, and it says, the letter that he took to the king of Israel read, "With this letter I am sending my servant Naaman to you, so that you may cure him of his leprosy." This is from the king of Aram to the king of Israel. Now, notice that's not what the servant girl said. She did not say that the king would heal Naaman. She said the prophet in Israel. And yet there's a miscommunication happening there. And then, so look at verse 7. Look what happens. As soon as the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his robes and said, "Am I God? Can I kill and bring back life? Why does this fellow send someone to me to be cured of his leprosy? See how he's trying to pick a quarrel with me." So the king of Israel freaks out because he feels that this king is trying to start a war with him. He sent this letter saying, "Hey, we want you to heal my servant Naaman. And if you can't do it," that's what he's thinking, right? Because this guy has a story. He has a story where he's been raided, where he's heard of Naaman. He's heard of his great battle feats, how he's kept the mighty Assyrians away. He has a narrative that he's now filtering all of his experience through. And he freaks out. Have you ever had an experience where something comes into your lap or something comes in front of you and it feels way, way beyond what you're capable of doing? And you freak out. something that is well beyond your capabilities, and you're expected to take care of it. You ever had a situation like that? That's a good situation for a trigger freak out. The king of Israel is deeply fearful, and his experience has taught him that this is bad news. Elisha, however, hears of it, and he tells the king to send Naaman to him. So Naaman goes to see Elisha, and Elisha doesn't even greet him, but sends out a messenger to give instructions about dunking in the Jordan River. So it says in verse 9, so Naaman went with his horses and chariots and stopped at the door of Elisha's house. Elisha sent a messenger to him to say to him, go wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored and you will be cleansed. All right, sounds good. The only problem is Naaman is a great man. And great men have expectations, right? I'm a great person. And you're not even going to come out and see me? You're going to send your servant, and then you're going to tell me to go dunk in what? And so we read in verse 11, but Naaman went away angry and said, I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call in the name of the Lord his God, wave his hand over the spot, and cure me of my leprosy. Are not Abana and Pharpar, I'm not even sure how to say that, the rivers of Damascus better than all the waters of Israel? Couldn't I wash in them and be cleansed? So he turned and went off in a rage. Because you don't do that to a great man. You don't talk to him like that. You come out and you show respect and you honor me because I'm great. See, Naaman's issue is not fear as much as pride. And he's triggered by his story, which has informed him and reaffirmed his greatness by everything that he's accomplished. And yet when Elisha treats him in what he feels is an unfair way, he storms off in anger. So both of these men are triggered in a different way, and they both lose it, but for very different reasons, and their stories are very much informing the way they interpret and experience reality. And so what I want to say from this is that your trigger points, the things, the issues the places where you know that this happens for you, if you can become aware of them and just think about them, these are your greatest teachers when it comes to healing. These places will show you where you have work to do. They will show you where you carry trauma. They will show you where you carry pride a lot of times. They will show you the places where you have work to do. But see, what we often do is when fear or anger or when we start to, what we often do is you just kind of shove it down. I don't want to deal with that. A lot of times we've been taught that we're not allowed to feel certain things. And because of that, we don't give ourselves permission we just shut it down. We just I can't be angry. We've learned ways to deal with life. We've got our fig leaves, we've got our medications, ways to get through it. And as we do that, if we don't address the issues, they just keep recycling. They just keep resurfacing. They just keep debilitating. And so our trigger points are a gift because our body is telling us, here's a place where you need to heal. Here's a place where something needs to change, where you need to grow. Here's a place where God might do some significant work with you if you'll let him. So that next time you get into a fight with your spouse, that same fight that you keep having over and over and over again, the one that never goes away, but it just keeps recycling itself. Unless I'm the only one that has those fights. Or if you're a parent and a child and you find yourself fighting a battle and you keep fighting the same battle. Or you're at work and you keep having the same issue with your coworkers or your boss. And these things keep recycling themselves. Next time you get in the middle of one of these things, stop. Stop for a minute. If you see it, just stop and say, wait, we've been here before. We keep doing this. We keep having this same recurring thing. Why? Why do we keep having this same fight? Why do we keep having this same recurring thing that never seems to get better but just seems to keep coming up? Step back, observe yourself in this place, and ask, why are we doing this? How am I interpreting this present moment? What am I feeling right now? Because we begin to look into this and just observe it instead of just being caught up in the lizard brain moment where we're not thinking at all. We can actually begin to see, oh, well, every time we talk about this, I begin to feel this, and it reminds me of this, and it makes me feel this way. And I guarantee you, most of the time, the person that you're having the fight with is not interpreting and experiencing the same thing, but their own story is informing and in giving them a different scenario that is doing the same kind of thing in their body. If we can stop and begin to recognize these trigger moments, they will help us acknowledge and then begin to move into a healing place where we can actually be proactive instead of reactive. Because we live in a super reactive society, right? Everything is reactive right now. Just react. It's the age of anxiety and anger. Just get angry, just fly off the handle, just turn around and get the last word and win. And I mean, it's just on and on. And we want to take steps to become proactive and not just reactive. We don't want to just simply live in lizard brain and fight or flight mode when it comes up. We want to start stepping back from it. This is part of renewing our mind. And we're going to talk more about this in coming weeks, about renewing our minds, because it's right there in the scriptures that we're to transform by renewing our minds. And this is the first part. You just step back and you just look and you observe this thing. And you're like, man, this is broken. This isn't going anywhere. In fact, it's spiraling down. What can we do different? And begin to observe it and let the scriptures guide us into a new path in those moments. Verse 13 is Naaman's servants. They come to him and they say, my father, these guys deserve a chunk of that money he's carrying because they really stepped it up here. My father, if the prophet had told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? I mean, how much more then when he tells you, wash and be cleansed? I mean, they're basically saying, Naaman, how much easier could this get? I mean, you came all this way, you brought all this money, you might as well try it. I mean, this is simple. Go dunk in the river. I mean, I know it's not clean. It's the Jordan. Some of you have been to the Jordan River. You know it's this little dirty creek. It's not impressive, but I know it's dirty. It's not real impressive for a great man to go dunk in the Jordan, but just try. I mean, you might as well just go after it. This was a count to 10 moment for Naaman, kind of like my moment in the car when I wanted to run the guy off the road. It really does work. Did you know that counting to 10 actually does work? It's actually a really good thing to do when you're flying off the handle. Step back, observe yourself, count to 10. Deep breaths. Oh, it actually does help. Anyway, Naaman takes a deep breath and he listens to his servants. Because when you're in that trigger moment, you're not thinking. Your lizard brain takes over. You're fight or flight. You're surviving. It's all about survival, and you just turn into a caveman or something. It's crazy how our thinking just leaves. But if you will observe yourself in these moments, you'll see what happens. You begin to notice it, and the more conscious we become of these moments and how we see, oh, there it is. And then the more you can start to step back from it and observe it, just for a moment, the more conscious you become of the cycle. and the more conscious you become of what's actually happening. And you can actually then, it's not this unconscious thing happening just automatically. It's not a reaction anymore. Now you have a choice, and you can move forward in a new direction. Okay, so kudos to Naaman's servants, because he should really have given them a lot of that cash. I don't know if he ever did. Because he was ready. He was ready to just, he was so proud and so angered in this moment. He was ready to go back home. He says, I will rather leave and live with my leprosy than take those kinds of orders and be treated that way. Right? He about went home with his leprosy. He was going to make a stupid choice. And yet, he had a count to 10 moment. His servants helped him. And he dunks in the river 7 times, and he is healed, just as Elisha said. Let's look at verse 14. And we're going to wrap up here. So it says, he went down, and he dipped himself in the Jordan 7 times, as the man of God had told him, and his flesh was restored, and he became clean like that of a young boy. Isn't that amazing? So here's Naaman, a great man. And then by the end of this, when he gets healed, he becomes a young boy, like a young boy. Now, what's that make you think of? Right? Jesus said, anybody who wants to enter the kingdom must become like a little child. Going into your trauma, dealing with your pain, facing your dark side is a humiliating, hard, humbling experience. You have to become like a child, because it will undo us. And you have to trust. It takes a lot of faith. But the result is the cleansing. I love that picture. He became like a child, and his skin was cleansed, and it became like that of a young boy. He has let go of his pride and become the kind of person who can heal. We're going to talk next week about renewing the mind specifically, and we're just going to continue going on. I hope this stuff is helpful, because this is the stuff that this is some of the stuff that has revolutionized my own life. When I started to really to take seriously my own need to heal and to walk on a path of healing, and to actually believe that God is up to doing that sort of thing and will very much cooperate and initiate that process in our lives, and we can become more whole. We can become new and different people, and we have practical things to teach on this. I have several things, practical ways, practices that we'll get to that have been helpful for me. And so I'm just going to share what I've done and things that I'm learning. I'm still very much, I'm on the journey. I'm not through the journey at all, but I know what's worked for me in so many healing ways. Anyway, I could tell lots and lots of stories about this. So we're going to continue, and I pray that you'll begin to observe yourself in these places and ask the Spirit who's in you. If you've trusted Christ, the Spirit is right there wanting to heal. A lot of times, actually, this stuff starts getting pushed out of us and starts coming to the surface because the Spirit is at work. This is what the Spirit's doing. He's pushing our trauma out and trying to heal us and bringing it to our mind and saying, hey, let's go. Let's heal. Let's renew this. Let's not stay in this stuck place anymore. Let's do something about it. So it's an opportunity. All right, let's pray. God, we trust you as our healer, as the one who has all power and has all capability of taking us to new places, to helping us heal through things that have been devastating, to help remove pride and make us like children. You've given us an incredible capacity to heal and to become new and different people. And you've given us tools, and you've given us your Spirit to lead us in that process. And so I pray that you would open our eyes, because the first thing is we open our eyes and begin to see the things that you're bringing to our attention. And I just thank you that your words in the Scripture are so powerful, and so they just teach us so much, and there's endless ways we can understand them and apply them. And I pray that as we move forward on this journey together, wherever we're at on this journey, and that you would bring us to the places where we need to grow and heal. And we thank you that the one who's began the work in us is faithful to complete it. And it's through Christ our Lord we pray. Amen.